Hey, it's the Procrastinating Professor here, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about my attempts to replicate an Atlas's paint job based on some art inspiration. So, when I started, of course, working on my Atlas, I was thinking to myself that, well, I definitely want to give it as much effort as I potentially am willing to sink into kind of a gaming piece, right? It was not meant to be a display piece, as my models typically aren't. At the same time, I wanted to make sure that I did it justice simply because it is my favorite mech. It's not the best mech in gameplay. There are a lot of objectively better 100-ton mechs out there, but it's kind of iconic. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide the tutorial into two different parts, simply because the tutorial is going to be too long if it was a single piece. And also I wanted to give it kind of like fair justice, right? I wanted to make sure that I spent some time going through some of my thoughts rather than kind of barreling through the painting tutorial, as I tend to do. Alright, so let's take a look at some inspiration just extremely quickly. Originally, of course, I was thinking for the longest time that I was going to base my Atlas off the paint job that was in the original Battletech TCG. So I played the Battletech TCG back in the day. Again, I'm dating myself in every video. And even though back then the Atlas wasn't necessarily my favorite mech, I did find some use out of it, and therefore I had kind of this childhood nostalgia attached to it. Now, of course, when I played Mech Commander 1, something like 20-something years ago, that kind of more or less cemented its image in my head ever since then. But what I did was I was looking around for Atlas art that would kind of inspire me to paint something. And I found that while there are many pieces of art, there are a lot of screenshots, a lot of pictures of Atlases out there, nonetheless, none really caught my attention the same way as the latest cover of the Total Warfare manual. So down here, of course, you see the picture, and you may be wondering to yourselves, well, Professor, why are you using Microsoft Whiteboard? It's such a strange way to present something. Well, that's because I'm basically going to be using this to kind of highlight and show what I'm doing, right? So throughout the entire tutorial, I'm going to be focusing on this. I'm going to just remove all of this so that it doesn't clutter the screen. So let's take a look at this piece of art. I'm going to go through step by step my thought processes and what I wanted to do, why I did what I did. So first off, I decided very early on that I wanted to use an airbrush to put down the base coat and do some of the initial highlighting. Again, as I mentioned in many of my videos, you can of course paint the model without an airbrush. For example, I recently posted on my Instagram some examples of some models that I didn't use an airbrush at all. I just use a typical normal brush with them. But usually if I want a fast paint job or reasonably fast paint job, I will use my airbrush. It gives us good transition in a relatively short period of time, very little effort, right? And for someone like me who is not a professional painter, I do this as a hobby. I don't have that much hobby time. So between making the videos and of course painting, I kind of want to save as much time as possible. So anyway, I decided I'm going to be using an airbrush, and looking at this picture, of course, it's quite easy to see that it's going to be a fairly dark coloration. So we are going to start with a black undercoat. So for the undercoat, I basically just use my Vallejo black undercoat, but you can use any sort of brand, it's going to be fine. Now, with that said, however, this was the first issue that I had, the green, right? So you can see down here that of course the Atlas is predominantly green. This is in the colors of the Eridani Light Horse. And I figured that, okay, I can definitely replicate the green. That's not a problem. But where are the light sources coming from? That's the first question. You see, typically when I do my Belmax, I actually do zenithal highlighting. Not the kind where you go from black to white and then layer the colors on top of it, but loosely speaking, I would airbrush on colors in increasing brightness on top of each other to kind of replicate a light source that's usually coming from the top. So usually, traditionally, if I were painting it, I would kind of assume that the light source was coming from the top a little bit at an angle to give me maximum of intensity, right? Which means that the top parts are going to be brighter, whereas the bottom parts are typically going to be darker. That's usually how it goes. But if you look at this piece of art down here, obviously this is not the case. You'll notice that in this piece of art, there are quite a number of different light sources. So first off, of course, the most obvious one is going to be the OSL. You have this object source lighting coming from the fire at the bottom down here, and it's going to illuminate the bottom parts of your map. Now, typically when you paint OSL, what you want to do is, in order to make the OSL really stand out, you kind of want to make the areas around the OSL darker. So typically speaking, under normal circumstances, if I were to do this as an artistic rendition of OSL to make the OSL stand out more, I would actually make many of these areas a little bit darker, right? The areas adjacent to the light. So there will be basically the red parts, the orange, the red, basically from the fire would stand out a lot brighter. But in this case, it is obviously not the situation. For those of you wondering, why would you do it that way? As I mentioned just now, if you have dark colors next to the OSL stands out a little bit more. But also, if your unit, well, if your object, in this case, if your atlas is well lit by a light source, then you won't see the OSL as much. You think about it, right? If there was a fire burning during the day, right, when the sun is as high, the intensity of the light coming from the fire is going to be diminished by the brightness of the sun. Alright, so let's talk about the second source of lighting. Very obviously, in this case down here, we have a secondary source of lighting coming from somewhere maybe at an angle, right? Now, the reason why I suspect that it's coming from this sort of angle is because, number one, you have this area down here where it's lit up, and the face down here seems like it has a spotlight on it. You see, if the light source was coming from a higher angle, like kind of what I usually work with when I do my zenithal highlights, then what you would expect is you would expect to see this upper part of the head illuminated, but that's definitely not the case in this situation. Down here, the middle of the face is illuminated, so there's something that's coming at kind of this lower angle, but it's still sufficient to illuminate most of the image. Of course, again, in this situation, it's a piece of art, right? So we shouldn't really necessarily try to read too deeply into it. But with that sort of information down here, I figured that, well, even though obviously the light source is coming a little bit more from this direction as opposed to this direction, this area down here seems to be a little bit darker, I nonetheless decided that I'm going to do a quote-unquote regular zenithal highlight so that you would usually get the lighter areas. For example, down here, which is consistent, down here that's consistent, and this area which is also consistent. It's sufficiently consistent for me to use a normal zenithal highlighting method, while I would later, of course, change the way that I'm doing it for the face. So with that said, to start the green, we use Arden Green from Scale 75, applied using an airbrush. So the Scale 75 paints actually airbrush very well. They're a little bit thick and a little bit gloopy, which may actually turn some people off if you're not familiar with this kind of paint, but they do airbrush very well. And in my experience, I've never added anything other than water for airbrushing Scale 75. You can, of course, add acrylic thinner or airbrush medium, whatever it is that you want to use, that's totally fine. But I've personally found it to be unnecessary for Scale 75 paints. So when you're watching the airbrush, of course, you will notice that I do not cover the entire model in the color that I'm using. As I always say, I always airbrush where I perceive there is going to be a little bit of light. So this can be, for example, upper edges, if assuming my light source is coming from the top, or surfaces that are facing the light. There can be another place that you can airbrush. But it's very important that you have some areas that are dark and you have some areas that are light adjacent to each other, and that helps with the contrast. And as you continue building the highlights, right, you subsequently highlight in smaller and smaller areas. What will happen is that the gradient change from your darkest color to the brightest color of whatever it is that you're using is the thing that is going to provide you the natural contrast. So in this case, for this model, of course, the darkest areas are going to be black. It doesn't always have to be black, but in the case of this model, that is what we're using. Whereas, of course, on the other spectrum, it's going to be a very light green. So the difference between black and light green is kind of where the contrast ranges. If you want good contrast, I always recommend using at least 3 colors, probably more. Me personally, I tend to use about 5 different colors, and that's really one of the reasons why some people, their models don't stand out that well, simply because a lot of people, they follow kind of a more traditional way where they just have a single base coat, a single highlight, and a single shade, which is just three levels, and that doesn't give you particularly strong contrast. In fact, for this model, if my memory serves me right, there's going to be kind of a total of about 6 levels of light. There's going to be black, 3 shades of green, and 2 highlights. Although I'll be using Scale 75 greens for this base coating step, feel free to use any other paint brands with similar shades that you may have lying around. You will notice that when I airbrush, the airbrushing process is actually pretty fast. When people get clogged airbrushes, it can be a combination of many factors. Number one, of course, it could be possible that the person didn't thin their paints enough, so it's a little bit thick and it's drying up a little bit fast. It's also possible that the person is not using enough pressure. Many people recommend about 25 psi, plus minus, right? Some people use 15, some people use 20, whatever the case. I really do like this green scheme quite a bit, so I may consider doing an entire Eridani lens in the future. Moving on to Sherwood Green, this is of course a lighter green, and we are going to focus on the areas again which catch the most light, but keeping it small and making sure that we are careful not to overspray too much. If you don't have an airbrush, it's still perfectly possible to do this sort of painting style with a normal brush. You can watch my recent Blood Bowl Elf tutorial if you want to learn more about painting a high contrast style with just a regular brush. Some may also prefer having no transitions on the armor plates, a little bit more like the Games Workshop heavy metal style paint job where the highlights are more focused on the edges, keeping most armor plates and flat surfaces consistently colored instead, and that's totally fine as well. So one note about airbrushing. Some people consider airbrushing kind of this mythical art, right? Where it's difficult to master, and some people that I know have been put off getting an airbrush simply because they are afraid that it's going to take a lot of time to master and whatnot. But if I'm being completely honest with all of you, I think, of course, cost aside, the fact is that it allows you to paint things a lot faster. So people sometimes ask me, right, Prof, do you think I should get an airbrush? And my answer is almost always yes. The only times when I say no would be if it really is a little bit too expensive at the point where you are, purchasing an airbrush. Or maybe perhaps if for various reasons you're concerned about fumes going everywhere from an airbrush, which can be contained and the risk can be managed, right? But I can't understand, especially for people who want to airbrush like enamels and whatnot with some organic solvents filling the air. For acrylic, water-based acrylic paints, maybe not as bad. But even then, of course, there's some people who have those concerns, especially those with, for example, young infants, or maybe perhaps they live in a household with people that have breathing difficulties. Then sometimes people are a little bit more careful, right? And that's totally understandable. But speaking honestly, an airbrush saves a lot of time, and my mother gave me one of the best pieces of advice in my personal opinion, which is you can always earn back money, but you can't gain more time, right? So for me personally, especially because I do this as a hobby, I do not do this full-time or professionally, I definitely want to save as much time as possible while still adhering to my personal standards of paint jobs. Having an airbrush allows you to apply all of these shades and all of these highlights fairly quickly. On a single model, you may not feel it as much, but when you have, for example, a unit of 5, 10 or 20 models, the time saving becomes spectacular. Lastly, for airbrushing the green, we're going to be using Fall Green, which is kind of this really light, slightly yellowish green. And again, the goal here is, of course, to push the contrast even further. In my case, of course, as I mentioned earlier, I kind of figured how I wanted the lights to be placed, kind of like a zenithal highlight. But depending on how you want to do your battle max, it's also possible that you use a more traditional armored fighting vehicle modulation style, which I kind of briefly touched on in one of my previous videos where I spoke about painting a half track for Flames of War. But of course, there are a lot of channels out there that do talk about some of these different methods of painting scale armored vehicles, which will be kind of different from how we place highlights in miniature painting. As an aside, I've started teaching one-on-one painting classes via Zoom, customized to what the student needs help with. Details are on my Ko-fi link down below in the description. Also, please do consider subscribing while you're there. What you'll notice from time to time when I'm airbrushing is that you'll see me go over the same area again with the airbrush, and that's because very often for many paints, a single layer does not actually achieve its full opacity, which means that if let's say you're airbrushing and you only spray a single layer with your airbrush, you're not actually getting the color in its fullest form. Typically, it takes a few layers to actually build it up to the color's actual brightness. So especially for brighter colors, or if you're working on brighter colors over a darker background, kind of like what I'm doing here, and very much like what I did in my previous video on painting my wood elf, you would find that you kind of need quite a lot of layers. Sometimes 2, sometimes even 3. Sometimes people ask me, right, Prof, how thin do you thin your paints for airbrushing? The answer is that it really depends, right? It depends on, for example, the paint itself. Some paints are very, very thin out of the bottle, like the Vallejo Air. They're very thin. They're basically almost like water. Whereas some brands like Scale 75 really thick. Vallejo, AK, a lot of these brands tend to be in the middle. Generally speaking, however thick the paint, you kind of want to bring it to the same consistency. People often say consistency of thick cream, and unfortunately, even though it pains me to say it, that's kind of correct in a sense. You just need to know how to get to that consistency, and once you're able to do that, you're able to actually thin your paints reliably and replicably without actually messing things up. While I have your attention, I'm curious, what variant of the Atlas do you enjoy using the most? So previously I mentioned that the face was lit in a slightly unusual manner. Usually, if the light source was coming from the top, you would expect these areas to be brighter, but they aren't, whereas the middle down here is being lit, which kind of implies to me again that there's a light source that's kind of coming sort of at a flatter angle, and that's totally fine. I think that this style of lighting looks great simply because it really highlights the face. It really highlights this center area and it makes it look super menacing, especially from this lower angle. And that's a fairly good way of thinking about faces. Faces, be it on atlases or on humans or anything that you're painting, should stand out. We are naturally drawn to faces, whether we like it or not, so having the face be brighter is a fairly normal thing for a lot of painters to focus on. So with that said, let's start painting the face. So to start off the whites, I'm using Bearing Blue from Scale 75. Of course, again, I am using just typical sticky tack for masking. Moving on to the next highlight of Arctic Blue, I am focusing on the center of the face. Usually when you paint white, the irony is that you don't necessarily want most of it to be white. In fact, white areas should probably be a little bit of an off-white of some sort, be it kind of a cooler grey or a warmer grey, depending on the kind of white that you want. And I'm going to finish off the white with just straight up pure white in the middle. So now that we're done with the green, let's talk a little bit about the OSL. Now again, you can very easily use all sorts of techniques to get the OSL on your model. In fact, many people don't necessarily use the airbrush for the OSL. They prefer the control that comes with a normal brush, and that's totally fine if you want to do it with a brush. But because I want to make things pretty fast, I am going to be airbrushing. I'm going to be airbrushing basically from a lower angle, as you'll see in the video later on. So I'm going to be highlighting the areas that are, well, red in the picture here, as well as, of course, getting a little bit down here and a little bit down here as well. Now, in the piece of art, it's not very obvious, but this black recessed area at the torso, in the piece of art, it looks like it's a little bit sunken in, right? And that's probably why the original artist didn't like this area up down here. Whereas on the model, what you'll notice is that these top parts actually protrude quite a bit. So much so that they protrude in a manner which I suspect might actually catch a little bit of the red light. However, again, for the sake of kind of replicating the cover, I decided that I was not going to do any OSL on the black parts, and I'll keep the black parts of the torso black. Now we're going to start with the OSL. I'm going to start with a slightly darker red. In this case, I'm using Gory Red from Vallejo. And I'm airbrushing from the bottom, imagining where the source of light is coming from. Being careful to try my best not to overspray too much on the green areas that shouldn't get the light. When my friends ask me how much do I use, I always shatter their brains by telling them that I typically airbrush at like 40 to 50. Now this is for a number of reasons, right? First things first, I'm not doing extreme fine detail work. I'm not airbrushing a human face. So for the most part, since I tend to use my airbrushing for a lot of base coating, I just use straight up high pressure just to make sure that the paint comes out. I can work with thicker paints without it clogging. It kind of gives me this nice smooth finish. You can kind of see in my videos that the paint comes out alright. It's not spluttering with dry drops and whatnot, which is a sign that your paint is drying too fast. So again, it could be too low pressure or too thick paint. Of course, high pressure means that you have less control, which if you're starting out airbrushing is something that you will have to pick up with time and experience. You don't even need a good airbrush. So for example, the airbrush that you very often see me using in all my videos, this was like a $10 or $15 airbrush. It's a brandless airbrush. I couldn't even recommend it to all of you, even if I wanted to. I bought it many years ago. The only things that I've changed would be the nozzle and the needle, because those sometimes get bent and whatnot. That's just part and parcel of using an airbrush. But it served me for very many years. Now, do I own a better airbrush? Of course I do. I do own an Infinity, but if, again, you watch all my videos, you'll find that I've only ever used it like maybe a couple of times, and only for very select things. I tend to treat that a little bit with more care, especially because it was a gift from a loved one. I cherish it a lot and take good care of it, whereas this cheap airbrush, I can just kind of use it very crudely and very brutally, and I have no emotional attachment to it whatsoever because it's so cheap. In this case, I'm painting the colors of my OSL lighting on top of a green base coated model. In many cases, especially if your light source is very intense, it may be better to apply a white or off-white on the areas that you intend to light and then paint on the colors of your OSL. This gives your OSL extra intensity and brightness. I then use a slightly orangey red. In this case, I'm going to be using AK's Scarlet Red as the next highlight. I like this kind of color for fire effects, simply because there's a little bit of the orangey hue to it later on. When I add the yellows, it pops up a little bit more. One of my friends was joking with me that in one of my previous videos, he could see that the flesh of my finger was being displaced by the pressure of my airbrush. So if anyone ever doubts me, you can kind of see it. I think that was the video on painting my ogre, where he said you could just see my flesh flapping about in the wind from my airbrush. I don't recommend using such a high pressure for your airbrush if you're not used to airbrushing. Let me just be very clear. I'm not here touting that you should use 40 psi. I'm just saying that's what I use, that's what works for me, and you can see it in action right now. It's perfectly possible and probably actually better to paint OSL with a normal brush instead of an airbrush, building up the intensity of the OSL in several steps of glazing or layering. The aspect that most people get wrong, however, is positioning where the OSL light hits, pulling light where there shouldn't be light, and vice versa. In the case of this model, I'm merely emulating the OSL light placement of the original painting, but as I mentioned earlier, if I did OSL quote-unquote properly for this model, I likely wouldn't have placed the lights in the exact same way. When in doubt, take an extremely bright light source, position it where you want your OSL light to come from, and take a photograph for your reference. So I looked at this picture, I kind of had two conundrums, right? The first conundrum that I had, of course, above and beyond the Zenithal thing which I spoke about earlier, was what color is this supposed to be? And what color is this supposed to be? Logically speaking, I would assume that it's supposed to be metallic, in a sense. I suspect the original artist was trying to go with sort of metal, shaved metal kind of situation down here. But the coloration was less so metallic and more so kind of this lilac sort of color. It is very possible, and this is just my speculation, that what the artist was trying to do was trying to contrast the red areas at the bottom with the blue areas on top, the cool blue areas. And you can kind of see throughout the model, there's a lot of blue lighting. there's a lot of blue parts coming up there. Whereas at the bottom here, there's a lot of red, there's a lot of yellow, there's a lot of orange. And that's kind of nice, with green being, of course, in the middle as a transitional color. So all that said, what I decided on was that I was going to paint this area lilac for the sake of it looking more like the art, not caring that it's supposed to be metal. Same for things like this. And I was going to consider things like this AC20, all of these areas down here. I'm going to assume that they are supposed to be black. And my assumption is because this area down here, which you can kind of see, which I actually drew an arrow over. Yeah, this area down here, you can kind of clearly see that it looks like it's supposed to be black. So I'm going to be assuming that it's supposed to be black. And these areas down here where you would expect to see maybe perhaps more bare metal, it is very obviously a different coloration from this lilac sort of coloration on top. So that's what I'm going to go with. Now for the lilac parts, I'm literally going to be using lilac from AK, and I'm going to be using just sponging for this. So sponging is a very common method that's used for weathering. Some people criticize it as being uncontrolled, ugly, unrealistic, so on and so forth. That's fine, but for the most part, I think it looks kind of alright, especially for our purpose today. Well, our purpose today is not to replicate what actual battle damage looks like, but rather to kind of replicate a painting, right? So we're just going to sponge this on the areas which correspond to where I noticed the lilac on the actual painting itself. In the future, I might do a tutorial about the more realistic ways of doing weathering, like salt or hairspray. But I think for small scale models like Battletech, sponging is a perfectly reasonable way to do weathering. Alright, so I'm about to be using an enamel wash to pin wash all of my panels. But before that, you need to hit the model with a gloss. You cannot do this without gloss. Some people will say it's to help the thing flow, that's true. But you also can have situations where if you did not cover it with a gloss, the enamel may seep into the other painted parts, may seep into the paint, it might be harder to clean up. It gets a little bit messy, so long story short, please make sure that you hit it with gloss. So I've used pin washers before, enamels, oils, you will have seen me use it in some of my previous videos, and these work very well for Battletech. Truth be told, I actually use acrylic paints more often than not for my Battletech panel lining. It's just that in this case, because I'm just going to be using black and I already have the enamel wash, I'm like, okay, let's save some time. The downside of using this, I should probably put this out there, is that the enamel pin wash I'm using is very smelly and a very pungent organic solvent smell to it. If you want really neatly lined panels, using enamel or oil pin washing is probably the fastest way. I do not ever recommend washing the entire model with an acrylic wash like Noun Oil unless you're willing to repaint your armor panels. Now, I'm going to be using some cotton tips, and you will notice that these cotton tips are not necessarily the kind that you use to clean your ears. The ones I'm using are ones that were made for modeling. You don't have to do this. It's perfectly fine to use just normal Q-tips or cotton buds for this purpose, but I have it lying around, so I might as well use it. As you can clearly see, there's still so much of it because I don't use this technique often enough. So what I do is I have a little bit of my odorless thinner that I dip the cotton bud in it, and then I aggressively rub the surface. Right, you see, I'm just rubbing without care in the world. And what will happen is that all of the enamel paints on the surface will come off, leaving me with the recesses still nice and lined. This method also works spectacularly well for armored fighting vehicles, works really well for gunpla. For those of you who love gunpla and can't be bothered to use Gundam markers, you can use this method as well. But again, for gunpla, you have to hit the model with some sort of paint, some sort of clear coat first. Do not directly use this on bare gunpla plastic. So I'm going to call part 1 here, and next video we're going to continue with more of the brushwork. In fact, there's a lot more brushwork than there is airbrushing. I'm kind of worried that the next video is going to be a bit too long, but anyway, if this video has been of any help to you, please do consider subscribing and supporting the channel on Ko-fi. And of course, check out all my other social media links down in the description down below. So until next time, take care.